Did I get the job?
Absolutely not.
Why not?
Because you're a baby boomer and I am a millennial.
Ah, well, Melanie, I am overqualified for this job.
I don't know where you got this. We don't do paper applications.
I made it. I don't do the internet.
Okay, that is the third time you have said that this interview, and it also says so on this homemade job application.
There you go, champ.
I don't know what this is for.
Don't you need a trophy anytime you... anything?
Oh, it's on. How'd you get here? Horse?
I drove. My car. I own it. After 8 more payments. How'd you get here?
I took an Uber.
Do not know what that is. I bet you're a vegan.
Yeah, because I'm not a monster. Look at who you guys voted for.
Yeah, that's right. I voted.
Touche.
This is the only way you'll ever own a house.
Learning how to text is the only way you'll ever communicate with your son. So...
Alright guys, who took my Sheryl Crow album?
Gen X. You know what? You're hired.
I quit.
Dad!
Greetings and salutations. You know, increases in the Social Security retirement age means that there's more people staying in the workforce. Now, for the first time in history, we have 4, and in some cases even 5 generations of people working together. Now, we all know that there's differences in generations. We've all talked about it, and we just watched a humorous video making fun of it. But why are there differences? Well, it's based upon the era in which a person was raised. Each generation has had different lifestyles, different political influences, changes in the educational system, and without a doubt, differences in technology. And all of these things can't help but impact the way a generation thinks, feels, and acts. Now, these differences often pose problems when it comes with interacting to each other, especially in the workplace. This obviously affects working relationships and can have an impact on morale as well. Personally, I believe that the majority of all problems, from our minor personnel problems all the way up to world political problems, lies with a failure to communicate.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
And a understanding of where the other party is coming from. And these issues aren't just isolated between supervisors and staff, but it affects all coworkers in general. If you're interested in this subject, then I welcome you to this class on Intergenerational Communications. My name is John Tracy. Many of you know me as BJ, and I'm the 911 director for Sumner County. I've been the director for about 7 years, and I've been with the department in total for about 26 years. Prior to that, I was a firefighter EMT for the Wellington Fire Department for 18 years. So you can do the math. Yes, I am a boomer.
Okay, boomer.
Now, let me say that I am not an expert at this field. I was recruited to teach this class, and subsequently I had to do a lot of research to put the information together. What I found out was I knew very little about different generations or about intergenerational communications. And most importantly, I realized that I had to learn a lot more if I was going to be successful. So, if you want to be a good leader and a good manager, you're going to have to spend some time studying each generation, their characteristics, how to manage them, and without a doubt, how to communicate with them. Okay, the objectives for this class are to identify certain characteristics of each generation, identify communication styles and preferences, be familiar with tips on how to better achieve and maintain good communications, and identify various communication mediums and the pros and cons of each. If you have a good understanding of each generation and the things that have impacted their lives, you'll have a better understanding of them when it comes to interacting with them and communicating with them. So let's look at the definition of a generation. A generation is defined as a group of people born around the same time and raised around the same place. People in this birth cohort exhibit similar characteristics, preferences, and values over their lifetime. Now, we're not going to talk about the silent or the traditional generation. Members in that age group are now going to be 75 years or older, and there may be some PSAPs that still have employees of that age, but they're going to be few and far between. So the first group we're going to go over are the baby boomers. Being a boomer myself, I'm probably going to talk more about this generation than the others. Obviously, I have a better understanding of it, and a lot of what I'm going to say is based on my own personal experiences. Baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. That makes their current age between 57 and 74. In 2015, there were 45.1 million boomers still in the workforce. As I said earlier, increased Social Security retirement ages means that there are more and more people staying in the workforce. And in that same year, in 2015, 65% of the boomers surveyed said they planned on working past age 65. So that has resulted in more people in the workplace and more generations working together. We were affected by the Vietnam War. It was the first war that was filmed, so the news was inundated not only with stories about the Vietnam War, but with video and pictures as well. We were impacted by the civil rights movement and the riots of the 1960s that occurred because of that. We were impacted by the sexual revolution, and we were impacted by the Cold War with Russia. Living close to Wichita and McConnell Air Force Base, we had a lot of intercontinental ballistic missile sites in our county, and there was a very heavy Air Force presence on a daily basis that reminded us of that Cold War with Russia. We were the radicals of the 70s. I still have a Pink Floyd t-shirt for all of you who know who Pink Floyd is. We grew up without cable television. We only had a television that had 3 stations. There was not a remote control even. When you wanted to change channels, you had to walk across the room and turn the knob on the TV. There were no cell phones. We had one wall-mounted phone in the kitchen. And we grew up without the internet. It wasn't even heard of at the time. Our internet was the public library with a selection of encyclopedias to browse through. Unfortunately, boomers started to see an increase in divorce rates, probably because of the sexual revolution and second marriages in the family. Some famous boomers, besides myself, of course, include Oprah Winfrey, Elton John, singer Madonna, President Bill Clinton, and actress Meryl Streep. Okay, after the baby boomers comes Generation X, or Gen X. Generation X was born between 1965 and 1980, making their current age between 41 and 56. And in 2015, there were still 52.8 million Gen Xers in the workforce. Because of the sexual revolution, more and more women decided that they wanted to have careers rather than being stay-at-home moms or housewives. So Generation X was the first generation that saw both parents working with a dual family income. Both my parents worked because we were poor, but most Gen Xers, both their parents worked because the mother wanted to have a career as well as the husband. Now, because both parents worked, Gen Xers became the first latchkey kids. They were the first kids who came home to an empty house after school, and they had to take care of themselves, and because of that, they had to grow up quickly. Gen Xers also grew up watching politicians lie. The first proof of politicians lying, rather, with President Nixon and the Watergate scandal. They started to see increasing divorce rates. Unfortunately, they started to see increasing layoffs of their parents and their jobs. Generation X technologically saw the birth of the internet. It wasn't as big as it was today, but they were the first generation that got to fully experiment with the internet. They also saw the birth of cell phones. They were just flip phones, but they were still cell phones. And some famous Gen Xers include singer Paula Abdul, forgive me if I butcher this name, Jeff Bezos, I'll just leave it at that, founder of Amazon, he's got a lot of my money, singer Katie Lang, President Barack Obama, Sheryl Crow, and actress Jodie Foster. All right, Generation Y, also known as Millennials, were born between 1981 and 1996. That makes their current age between 25 and 40. And in 2015, there were 54 million millennials in the workforce, making them the largest generation working. Now, Generation Y grew up during a time period in which the world was very, very focused on raising children and protecting them from the evils of the world. So they grew up very, very sheltered with their parents protecting them. A lot of them grew up in single-parent families as divorce rates increased, and they were the first generation that was kept busy all the time. In fact, they even had schedules in their lives that told them what they were going to do during the day. Millennials were impacted by a lot of traumatic events, including school shootings, the big one being in Columbine. They were also impacted by terrorist attacks, and in particular, the ones of 9/11. And they, technologically wise, they grew up with the explosion of the internet. They saw the evolution of email, doing research by the internet, Google, an increase in video games, and they saw the advancement of cell phones going from flip phones to smartphones. So they were on the cusp of technological advances as well. Some famous millennials include North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, tennis star Serena Williams, Mark Zuckerberg, the developer of Facebook, NBA star LeBron James, U.S. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the UK's Prince Harry. And finally, we get to Generation Z. Generation Z was born between 1997 and 2012, making their current age between 9 and 24. Now, because many of them are still not in the workforce, we don't know how many are working. We don't know very much about their work habits as of yet, but I'm sure that will be studied in the future. Gen Zers grew up during post-9/11 life. They saw the Great Recession of 2006 to 2008, which was a global recession, by the way. They were the very first to have free access to technology. They don't remember a time when there were no cell phones or no internet. They grew up with high-speed internet and lightning-fast upload times. They grew up with smartphones. They never used a landline telephone. Many of them don't know how to use a landline telephone. They grew up during a time period where families thought that everybody should be involved in the responsibility. Everything should be shared, so they had increasing household chores and participation in family matters. They saw the election of our first black president, and some famous Gen Zers include singer Billie Eilish, global warming activist Greta Thunberg, forgive me if I butcher this name, TikTok star Lil Nas X. I like his song, just can't pronounce his name. And finally, the survivor of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School mass shooting, David Hogg. Okay, let's talk about some of the differences between each generation. And while there's a lot of differences, we're only going to focus on those differences at work, because that's what this class is about, is communications at work. So we're only going to worry about those characteristics that involve the workplace. As you can see on the left, we have three generations: Boomer, Gen X, and Millennial. Gen Z is not included. As we've learned, there are still a lot of Gen Z that are too young to be working. Because there's not many of them in the workforce, we don't know much about their work characteristics. So we're not going to be able to include them in this examination. So I know this isn't live, it's not interactive, it's a recorded class, so just play along the best that you can, and we'll see if we can learn something about these generational differences. Let's get started. This generation is very, very driven. This generation are workaholics. They invented the 50 and 60-hour work week. They believe that long hours equals self-worth, self-identity, and self-fulfillment. Their work ethic is, if you produce a good quality of work, you must have a good work ethic. If the quality of work you produce is poor, then you have a poor work ethic. And this generation believes that you work until the job is done. Regardless of how many hours it takes, they will work until the wee hours of the night, if that is what is necessary. Now, which generation do you think this belongs to? Okay, if you said baby boomers, you were correct. All of these are characteristics of the baby boomer generation. Okay, this generation is very, very ambitious. They're always looking on the horizon, what is next for them. Whatever project they're working on, they're already looking forward to the next project. They're great at multitasking, which is wonderful for our industry, and they're very, very tenacious. They want to be included in all aspects of the job. They want to be seen, and they want to be heard. Unfortunately, this generation believes in being off the clock at 5 p.m. They will not work a minute longer than necessary. You can set your watch by them. And to them, work is just a gig, or it is just something to do between the weekends. Which generation do you think these characteristics belong to? Okay, if you said this was the millennial generation, you are correct. All of these work characteristics belong to the millennials. Okay, that leaves us with Generation X. Their work ethic and time at work values include having a good work-life balance, because their parents were boomers, their parents were workaholics. They know the effects of working too long on the family. So they cherish a good work-life balance. They believe in working smarter and not harder. They're very project or task-driven. If you give them a project, they're going to stay on it until it is finished. They're very self-reliant. If you remember right, Gen X was latchkey kids. They were the ones responsible for taking care of themselves after school because both parents were working. That makes them very self-reliant on the job as well. They do want some structure and direction on work. And they believe in equal pay for equal work. They're willing to work overtime as long as they get paid overtime. Just on the opposite, they believe if you get done with the job early, then you should be able to go home early. Let's talk about skill building. This generation believes that the more skills you have, the bigger resume you can build. They're not very attached to a job. If they're not being fulfilled, they will move on to a job that does fulfill them. So they believe that the more skills you have, the more secure you are at moving to another job if you have to. They believe work ethic is important, but it's not as important as building up your skills. Which generation do you think this is? And I will dispense with the Jeopardy music because you will go crazy if you hear it by the end of this class. Okay, if you had a few seconds to think about it, if you said it was Generation X, you are right. These are all skill building characteristics of that generation. This generation thinks that training is important, but skills are only necessary to ease stressful situations. They're not concerned with building skills for a resume or building skills to make themselves better at their job. Their philosophy is that the more skills you have, the less stressful situations you will have to encounter. Which generation do you think this is? If you said millennial, you're correct. These are all characteristics of the millennial generation. And that leaves us with the baby boomers. If I had put this in earlier, you would have got it because this is a no-brainer. Because of their work ethic, boomers believe that skills are an important ingredient to your career, but not as important to work ethic. That is a priority. When it comes to values at work, this generation surprisingly cares very little about advancement. They're oriented about work, but if they get promoted, fine. If they don't, that's fine as well. They expect to influence the conditions of the job. They want feedback, and they want some of their requirements of the job that they think to be fulfilled. They like a casual work environment. They like work that is meaningful and innovative. They're very project-oriented. That's maybe a hint right there, and they're very outcome-oriented. Which generation do you think these characteristics belong to? If you said Generation X, buy yourself a prize because you got it right. This generation believes that because of available technology, it should allow flexibility in the job. In fact, a lot of them like to work from home because that is now possible because of today's technology. Like Generation X, they expect to influence the job, their job conditions. They have high expectations of their bosses and their managers. They're very goal-oriented. They are into careers, and they are into stability in their career. They also like a workplace that offers diversity, that is highly technical, and a fun work environment. Which generation do you think this is? And these characteristics also belong to the millennial generation. Again, this is a no-brainer. If I'd have put this slide earlier, there's a spoiler in here, heavy focus on work. That obviously leads to the baby boomer generation. They're very loyal to their job. They're very process-oriented. They're not so much concerned with how to do the job they're not as much concerned about why you do the job as much as they are how the job is done. They're into good working relationships at work. They strive to do their very, very best. They make good team players, and they do want some respect at work. This generation believes that work is a difficult challenge. They also believe that it is a contract between the employee and the worker. And unfortunately, many of them think that it is just a job, not so much a career, but it is a job. Which generation do you think these characteristics belong to? And if you said Generation X, you are right. Spoiler alert, this generation believes that work is an exciting adventure. It is a career. And this is a big clue right here. It is work and then retire. That is the whole objective of life, is that you work, you have a job, and you work towards retirement. In fact, most of them want a clear avenue towards retirement. If you said boomers, you got it right. This leads us to millennials, who believes that work is a means to an end. They want nice things, they want a nice phone, a nice car, and a nice house, and that means they have to work to get to it. Not necessarily they want to work, but if they want the finer things in life, then they know that they have to have a job to accomplish that. They also believe that work should be very, very fulfilling, and that work should be very flexible. Again, technologically wise, they think they should be able to work from home or work from anywhere. In fact, as long as they get the job done, it doesn't matter where they do it, when they do it, or how they do it. They're focused on the end result. And these are very, very easy. This generation believes that communications is a touch-tone telephone. And if you guess boomers, you got that right. That's obvious. Boomers were not born with technology. They had to acquire technology as it became available in the workplace. So they're very, very used to touch-tone telephones. They're not very acclimated to cell phones or sending text messages. Because of their work ethic, however, boomers do believe to call me anytime. If it's work-related, you can call me at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's all a part of the job. Generation X, on the other hand, they believe that cell phone is their communications, but only call me at work. Don't call me at home. Feel free to call me if it's work-related when I'm at work, but do not bother me when I am off duty. And finally, millennials, their communications is the internet, email, or MMS message. In fact, millennials hate the telephone. They hate talking on the telephone. One of the videos I watched when I was researching for this class, a millennial just flat out said, if you call me, I'm not going to answer it. I'm going to let it go to voicemail. If you want an immediate response from me, you better send me a text message. So millennials hate the telephone. Okay, because there's differences in generations, there's differences in how we communicate with them. And when you're communicating with baby boomers, you need to be diplomatic. Remember, they're the generation that likes to have respect, so be very, very diplomatic with them. They prefer face-to-face communications. However, they do want the communications documented. So if you do face-to-face communications with them, you need to follow up with a memo or a letter or an email saying, pertaining to our face-to-face communications the other day. That way it is documented. They want you to be open. They want you to be very, very direct. The reason they like face-to-face communications is they like looking at the body language. They prefer to communicate where they get the full benefit of the communications. They like a friendly rapport. They don't want a bunch of conflict. And if you emphasize the mission and the vision with baby boomers, that will help out in your communication because, again, they're very work-driven. They're very loyal to the company, mission, and vision. So if you remind them of that, you'll be able to communicate with them a lot better. When you're communicating with Generation X, be very blunt and very direct. They don't want to be lied to, so be totally honest with them at all times. They prefer immediate communications. If you have something to say to them, say it to them now. Don't beat around the bush and wait later on. They want just the facts. This is something I failed to mention on the boomers. The boomers don't want a big, long-winded story. They want a summary of the story. Well, Generation X, they just want the facts. They don't want your opinion. They don't want to know what you're feeling. They just want the facts of the communication. Their number one preference for communication is email. Remember, this is the generation that was first exposed to the internet and first exposed to email. So naturally, it's their preferred communication method. They like communication to be informal. Doesn't necessarily have to be documented for them. And they have the best potential to bridge any generation gap or communication gap, excuse me, that you have in your organization. So if you have a communications gap, use your Gen X's to try to bridge that. In fact, one of the things I failed to mention, all of the work characteristics combined, your Generation Xers are going to be your best workers. They're the best well-rounded workers. They possess some of the characteristics of all of the generations. When communicating with millennials or Generation Y, Be polite. Again, they want respect. They don't want to be talked down to. So be polite with them, be positive, be respectful, be motivational, but they prefer electronic communications over direct face-to-face or telephone communications. So your positive, respectful, motivational nature will have to be in the tone of the words that you use in your communication because they prefer electronic communications. They prefer email or voicemail. Again, do not call them on the telephone. If you do, you're going to end up getting their voicemail. Again, don't talk down to them. And Generation Y likes a little humor in their communication. Again, they like fun-loving work, so they want some humor, and I've tried to inject some humor into this training class, so maybe the millennials will like my training class. Okay, by now you're probably judging my presentation. You're probably judging me. For example, you're saying I'm a Gen X, and very little of that applies to me. I'll say this more than once. It's important that you get to know your people. You cannot stereotype people simply by their age and the generation they were born. These characteristics are generalities. They're not specific to every single member of a particular generation. So you can't lump everybody into one category. Someone born on the cusp between two categories may possess multiple characteristics of two different generations. For example, my son was born in 1981. He may have characteristics of Gen Xers and millennials, so you have to take that into consideration. You have to take into consideration somebody's socioeconomic background. Just because you have a Gen Zer doesn't mean they're going to be technologically savvy. If they grew up in a poor family that didn't have the internet, they couldn't afford smartphones, they may not be all of that knowledgeable in the use of the devices and social media and things like that. So everyone is an individual, and it's important that you as leaders and managers get to know your individuals, get to know their characteristics, so that you will know where they fit in. Before we start talking about communication methods and mediums, let's take a real quick look at basic communications, if you remember from your PST1 class. The definition of communications is the transmission of an idea from one person to another with understanding. And the reason the words with understanding are italicized is because that is the most important part of communications. If you do not have understanding, then your communications has failed. In fact, George Bernard Shaw said that the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So feedback is extremely important in all of your communications, just to make sure that everything was understood. How are communications relayed? And this is something we use in our radio communications training to teach just how difficult it is to communicate by radio. First of all, 55% of all communications is relayed by body language. Looking at the person that you're talking to, you can see whether they're smiling, that they're enjoying the conversation that you're having, if they've assumed a defensive posture, if they appear to be angry, if they're rolling their eyes. All of these body language traits help you in deciphering the communications that is taking place. So over half of all communications is by body language alone. Another 38% is by the tone of voice that is used. Are they talking friendly? Do they sound angry? Are they using sarcasm? I'm sure we've all received some sarcasm from a field unit, and we've probably dished some sarcasm back to them. That's another 38% of communications. That leaves only 7% of communications, the actual words that are being used. Again, we teach this in radio communications training because you already lose half of your communication ability because you go by tone of voice and the actual words used over the radio, and most of the time the tone of voice affects your perception of what that communication is. The same thing is applicable to intergenerational communications if you're communicating in writing, by text message, by social media, whatever, anything where you do not have face-to-face communications, you immediately lose half of that communication ability right there. So you have to be aware of this whenever you're communicating with anybody, let alone communicating across generations. Communication preferences according to generation, and again, get to know your people as individuals. But in general, boomers like face-to-face communications and telephone communications. Gen Xers like face-to-face, they like telephone, and they like email. And if you remember the characteristics of each generation, the technology fits in here. Generation X was the first generation to come about with the evolution of the internet. So they like email. In fact, I have one Gen Xer I know still has a Hotmail account, for any of you that remember Hotmail. Gen Y, they like IM or SMS messaging as well as email. And again, remember, Gen Y does not like the telephone. They will not take your telephone calls. If you call them, it'll probably go to voicemail. Finally, Gen Z, and that's just where the technology has just exploded. They prefer to communicate through instant messaging or text messaging as well as social media. So you have to take all of this into consideration. But again, remember, these are generalities. These are not specifics. As an example, I'm a boomer. I prefer email myself. A lot of that is because I'm a workaholic and I can take a break in whatever I'm doing, shoot out a quick email, and immediately return to my work, whereas face-to-face communications and telephone communications tends to take away from that. I sit here and I think, well, I'm having this telephone conversation when I could really be working on such and such. So I prefer email, so just remember, all of these are generalities. With that said, in preparation for this class, I took a survey of my staff to see exactly what their communication preferences were, to see if it fit the generational characteristics that are being put out there. 3 of my staff didn't respond to the survey at all, so apparently they don't like to communicate at all. But again, I'm the only boomer in the organization, and as I said, I prefer email, whereas the stereotype is boomers like face-to-face and telephone. This is, again, you have to get to know your people as individuals and not go by stereotypes. I have 3 Gen Xers. All 3 Gen Xers prefer face-to-face communications, according to what they told me. And that fits in with their characteristics, but they also like telephone and email. I have 11 millennials. 10 of those said they prefer face-to-face communications. 1 said they prefer social media. And again, millennials are into technology. They're supposed to prefer instant messaging and text messaging, whereas this here indicated the majority of them prefer face-to-face. I have 1 Gen Zer. Their preference was email. And again, the stereotype says they're supposed to be instant messaging and social media. So none of the responses I got fit the stereotype. So it's important, again, to get to know your people. And from what I found out here, the vast majority of my people, face-to-face communications is the default that will work across all generations. Let's talk about some pros and cons of different communication mediums. And let's just start off with face-to-face. The biggest pro of face-to-face communications is the fact that you get to see the body language of the person you're communicating with. You get a full 100% communication effect across all of the spectrum: body language, tone of voice, and the actual words that you used. So without a doubt, face-to-face communications is the back. You get instant feedback if both people are participating in the conversation. Some of the cons is there's no documentation. If you have face-to-face communications and you want it documented, you're going to have to follow up with an email or a memo of some type. And again, boomers like documentation in their communication. So if you're communicating with a baby boomer, you definitely want to document it. And it is difficult to deliver mass communications. If you work in a large PSAP, it's going to be very difficult to have face-to-face communications with each and every member of your staff. This is where you could possibly use the chain of command, communicate face-to-face with your dispatch supervisors, and they in turn relay the message to the staff on their shifts. But you also have to be wary about the message getting misconstrued somewhere in the relaying or the transmission of it. It's kind of like the old game rumors, where you pass a message on from one person to another, and you see how that message gets changed by the time it gets to the end. So be very, very careful using face-to-face communications, and make sure that the message is clearly understood by all people involved. When using face-to-face communications, watch your posture. Remember, body language is the majority of the communications that is being relayed, so watch your posture. Don't get too close, don't get in their space, don't appear to be too laid back or that you're disinterested in their communication. So watch your posture, make sure that it remains neutral. Maintain eye contact. This shows that you're interested in the other person, you're interested in what they have to say, or you're interested in their feedback. There's the old saying, most often we listen to respond rather than listen to understand. So maintain eye contact and actively listen so that they feel like you are generally interested in the communication process. Choose your words well. Once they come off your lips, you can't take them back. So if you have to stop, pause, and think in the middle of a conversation to make sure that your words are wise and that you're relaying them in the manner you want to, you by all means can do that. So don't be afraid to pause and think. Be audible. Use clear, concise, good diction and all that good stuff when you're talking to somebody. And again, actively listen. A conversation or a communication is a two-way process. It's not just a one-way process. Written communication, whether it's in the form of a memo or a letter, some of the pros is it can be mass distributed. You can print off a letter or a memo and make photocopies of it and stick it in everybody's mailbox, and it is documented. You have proof that the memo was written. Some of the cons is there's no read receipt. Just because you stick a memo in somebody's mailbox doesn't mean that they're going to read it. And there's no instant feedback. With that face-to-face communications, it's a two-way conversation. With a written memo or a written letter, you send them the memo or the letter, but you don't know that they necessarily understood it right or that they've provided feedback. You have to wait for that feedback to occur if they indeed take the time to respond to it. When communicating in written form, make sure that you check the style. Obviously, memos and letters are formatted differently, so make sure that the style fits the type of communication you're using. Make sure the body of the text is clear. This is your main communication. Make sure it's understandable. Make sure that you get to the point. Make sure that it is very clear and concise. Keep it simple. You don't have to write a college thesis. You're simply writing a memo or a letter about one particular topic. So keep it very, very simple. Use bulleted lists and headings. This helps with the outline of your letter and your memo, helps them understand what you're talking about, condenses it down somewhat. Conclude with a summary, an inspiration, or something motivational. You want to inspire the person to take action on whatever your memo or letter is in reference to. Be sure to direct them to any attachments. That way they make sure that if you have something attached to your letter that they see it. And always have a colleague check it out before distributing it. Not only can they check for spelling and grammar, which may not get caught by your computer software, but they can just check it over for the style, your tone of voice, just to the general content to make sure that you're coming off in the same emotion that you want to put into the letter. Like a written memo or a letter, email can be mass distributed. You can send it to more than one person. It is documented. And again, it may not get read, and there is no instant feedback with email. My email account is set up so that I get a read receipt anytime anybody opens the email that I send them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to get read and it's not going to get understood. With email, subject lines are important. Always fill out the subject line on your email. That denotes the content of the email, the topic that you're referring to, and also the importance of the email, whether or not they make it a priority to read it or not. Again, like written medium, keep your email simple. Don't muddle content. Email should be on one subject and one subject only. If you do send out an email that is on multiple subjects, make sure in the subject line that you reference that, multiple topics, multiple subjects, several items, something that denotes that your email is about more than just one topic. And if you do have more than one topic, you might want to put it in a bulleted or a numbered list of some type so that the different topics are clearly divided. That way they won't miss something in your email. Watch your tone, and the same way with all written mediums or all communications in period, is watch your tone. Make sure you don't sound too harsh, or just the opposite, that you may not sound harsh enough if this is a serious email. Avoid exclamation marks and emojis. They have no place in emails. Never send when angry, and this is kind of in general communications. Don't conduct any communications at all when you're angry. Always stop, cool off, take time and think about it before you send anything. Proofread before sending. Again, just like a letter, proofread for spelling and grammar and content, and always proofread the recipients. You don't want to unintentionally send an email to the wrong person. So make sure that the audience you're sending it to is the ones in the to line on your email. Beware of group emails. If you send out an email to too many people, the email server may consider it to be spam and end up sending it to their junk box instead of their inbox, and they may not get the email at all. So make sure on your mass distribution that you're not getting too carried away, because you don't want your email flagged as spam. And also, and this is good on any form of communications, consider any legal ramifications, because an email is subject to open records requests, just like any other form of documentation in your agency. Text messages can be mass distributed. You can send a text message to more than one person. Be wary about sending out group text messages, though. We'll discuss that here in a minute. They are documented. You can always take a screenshot of the text message that you sent, of the conversation that took place, and it can be checked anywhere. You don't have to wait till you come to work to check for a memo in your box or a letter in your box. Anybody's text message can be checked wherever they're at, whether they're at home, whether at work, or wherever they are. Some of the cons of text messages is beware of costs. If the person you're sending it to does not have one of those unlimited talk and text plans, it may cost them money to receive text messages. So make sure you're not incurring any financial hardship on anybody. And here's a biggie, is beware of the Kansas Open Records Act. The Kansas Open Records Act has said that text messages are a part of the open records process. So if you send a business text message to one of your staff members, their phone is then subject to court examination, and they may not want some of the pictures on their phone examined in court. We, at our agency, we have a policy that you do not use your text message for business purposes. You know, if that's your only form of communication, then use your cell phone to call in sick if you have to be, but do not send text messages for business purposes on your cell phone, because if the situation arises where it is subpoenaed or requested through Quora, then everything on their phone is open to court examination. If you do decide to communicate via text messaging, get permission before you start texting. Make sure it's not going to cost them money. Some people may think that's an infringement of their personal time if you start sending someone a text message when they're off duty. Try to text during normal hours. You certainly don't want to send a text message in the daytime to one of your night shifters who's home trying to sleep and get their rest. Include your name at the beginning or the end of the text message so they know who it's coming from. I know I have my messaging app set up to where everything is signed with BJ regardless of what I send. Be courteous and be professional. That goes for any kind of communication you do. Before you send that text message, ask yourself, is this really necessary? Is this not something I can do through a memo or through an email? Always question yourself whether it is really critical and necessary that you send that text message. Beware of group texts because responses to your text may go to everybody. I know there's times that I have been caught in a group text message and you start getting responses from everybody that was included, and it can get quite annoying at times. Proofread before you send, kind of like talking. Once you hit that send button, you can't retract it. That message is already gone. And a biggie on text messages is let the communication end. You don't always have to have the last word. You don't always have to send the last emoji. Let the communications end when it needs to end. Communicating through social media, it can be mass distributed. In fact, it's an online post that once you put it on there, anybody is available to see it. It is documented. Again, you can take screenshots of what you've posted. It can be checked anywhere. Most everybody has a cell phone nowadays. Most everybody has a smartphone with internet access, so they can check social media regardless of wherever they're at. Make sure it's private, though. If you open up a social media account just to communicate with your staff members, make sure it's a private account that the public can't get into. That's something else we're going to discuss in the next slide, is make sure that the content cannot be shared. And of course, there's always ways around that. But you don't want to make a social media post communicating with your employees something that is very private and then have one of them share it to their open social media account. So make sure not only that it's private, but make sure it's not shareable. Some of the cons of social media is that it is very, 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 and here I go saying very, very again, it's very diverse. When I was researching for this class, I was, as a boomer especially, in awe of the number of social media platforms that are out there. I just couldn't imagine. So trying to find a social media platform that all of your staff members have, especially across generations, is going to be very, very difficult. Using social media as a communication tool, again, make sure it's private. You don't want to open up a social media account that the public has access to. Do not allow sharing of any of the posts. Always be professional. And here's a biggie on any kind of open communications. Never call out an employee in a group. If you're communicating with your people by social media, you don't want to get on there and make a post about one particular individual. Certainly that is a big, big no-no. That'll kill your morale quicker than anything. Using multiple forms of communication, it's great. You can choose a form of communication that fits all of the generations and their communication preferences, but it's going to be extremely exhausting and time-consuming. If you decide that you want to have a face-to-face communication with somebody and then follow it up with a written memo and then send them an email to make sure that they got it, or send them a text message to follow up, you're going to be spending a lot of time communicating. So you can use multiple forms of communication, but it's going to wear you out. So your best bet is to find one form of communication that everybody can acclimate to. Okay, some tips for establishing good communications across generational lines. First, it's important that you understand each generation's characteristics. We've briefly reviewed them in this class, but it needs to be examined a lot more in depth. Study each generation, find out what influences them, find out the lifestyles they grew up in, what things impacted their life, especially technological wise. Also check their socioeconomic background, as I said. Just because they were raised in a certain generation does not mean that they were privileged to the same technological advances that generation had. In other words, learn your staff, get to know your people. You may not always agree with where they're coming from, but if you have a better understanding of where you're coming from, then that'll at least get you a good start towards finding common grounds and communicating. Set some expectations for culture and behavior. We have to banish stereotypes on generations. We've all said, well, that's a millennial for you. That type of thinking has to stop. We have to accept and respect differences between each generation. We have to try to avoid prejudices. In other words, in order to communicate well, we have to find common ground that we can all stand on in order to achieve good working relationships. Be willing to teach and willing to learn. Like I started off with this class, I'm certainly not an expert at this, and when I started doing research to put this class together, I realized how much I really didn't know about it. So you have to be willing to learn about this subject, and you're going to have to be willing to teach this subject to others, because not everybody in your organization is going to be willing to invest the time in studying different generations and communications between the generations. You're going to have to identify communication preferences, and again, you can't go by the stereotypes. You can't go by what the experts say, because everybody is an individual. If you have to, do like I did and just take a survey of your people and find out what their preferred method of communicating is. This is the 21st century. We can no longer communicate how we prefer to communicate. We have to learn to communicate how they want to communicate. And again, ask, don't assume. Okay, if you're still awake, and if you've made it this far in the class, you're still hanging in there, and if you've listened attentively and took notes throughout the entire class, the green area on the circle is what you've learned about intergenerational communications. The red area is what you still need to learn about the subject. Again, I definitely, just the research I did for this is just the tip of the iceberg. There is still a lot more that I myself need to learn about communicating across generational lines. And I certainly hope that you will follow suit and do the same thing. Again, this just scratches the surface. It is in no way an in-depth study of communicating across generational lines. I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for participating in this class. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it wasn't too dry and boring for you. I hope my monotone voice didn't put you to sleep. The last two slides here have some of the reference information that I used in putting this class together. Feel free to pause this presentation, copy down some of those links, or if you want to, just go to Google and Google the subject matter. You'll find a lot of information about it. But I hope you do continue to learn more about it so that we all can get along better and communicate together. So again, thanks for attending the class. Carry on the good work. You all do wonderful work out there for your communities. You're good, dedicated public servants. And I thank you all, and we'll see you on the next one.